Didn't think a man fixing tractors would notice a woman cleaned up, she said, leaning against the barn door in a sundress, hair down for the first time, golden in the evening light. I looked at her once. The way you look at something you've been carefully not looking at for 2 weeks. I noticed, I said. She pushed off the door frame and walked past me close enough that I caught the scent of her, something warm, like the end of a working day turned into something else entirely. Good, she said, without turning around. Before we begin, has someone ever shown up looking like that right when you'd convinced yourself to keep your distance? Drop it in the comments, hit subscribe, and let's go back to where this all started. My name is Colt Mason, and I'll save you the trouble of asking. No, I'm not from anywhere in particular. Not anymore. I'm 41 years old, a fabricator and field mechanic, and I've been living out of a truck cab and a steel toolbox since my mid-20s. Tennessee is where I started, but Tennessee is just a place on a map now, the way all places eventually become when you've left them behind enough times. I've welded pipeline in Oklahoma, rebuilt irrigation rigs in the Montana high country, set structural steel on farm operations from the Kansas flats all the way down through Georgia red clay. People don't usually remember my last name. They remember the work, or they remember the hands that did it. I've learned to be fine with that. What I'm less fine with, and I'll admit this plainly, since we're already here together, is the fact that I've never quite figured out how to stay. Not anywhere. Not with anyone. That's not self-pity. That's just the honest shape of my life as I've lived it. There are decisions I made young that I'll carry the weight of for the rest of my days, and there are decisions I never made at all, which turned out to be their own kind of heavy. You learn to distribute the load. You don't learn to put it down. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That warm May morning I want to tell you about, it didn't start as anything. Most of the important mornings don't. I was westbound on a 2-lane county road somewhere between Amarillo and the edge of nothing, the kind of road that doesn't show up on the first page of any map app because there's no particular reason to go there unless you already know why. The air coming through the cracked window smelled of wet soil and new grass, that specific smell that only exists in the first weeks of May after a hard April, when the ground has finally absorbed everything the sky threw at it and is quietly getting on with the business of growing. The light was low and golden and honest the way early morning light can be before the heat takes over. I had a job lined up at a ranch operation about 40 miles out, a week's worth of fabrication work, nothing complicated, and I was thinking about coffee and not much else. The steam rose in a clean white column straight up into the morning sky, like a signal fire I hadn't meant to light. Then my radiator decided it was done. Not dramatically, it never is, with trucks like mine. Just a slow pressure creeping into the temperature gauge, then a smell, sharp and sweet and wrong, and then the steam curling up from under the hood in a way that left no room for interpretation. I pulled onto the gravel shoulder and cut the engine and sat there for a moment listening to it tick and hiss in that wounded way machines have when they've been pushed past the point of protest and into surrender. I've heard that sound more times than I can count. I've felt it too, in my own way, though that's not the kind of thing I'd say out loud to just anyone. I got out, gave the hood a few minutes to lose some pressure, then lifted it and had a look. Cracked lower hose, worn through almost to the fiber. The kind of failure that doesn't surprise you, the kind that makes you realize you'd been quietly expecting it for a while and just hadn't said so. I had a spare length of hose in the bed and enough coolant to limp somewhere, but the coupling was wrong sized and I knew it before I even pulled the tape measure. I was going to be here a while. I straightened up, put my hands on the fender, and looked out at the country around me. Flat. Open. The sky enormous in the way that Texas skies are enormous, not comforting, exactly, but honest. There's nothing out here to lie to you about how small you are. I've always respected that, even when I didn't want to. That's when I heard it. A low, rhythmic diesel knock, steady and deliberate, coming from the field on the far side of a wire fence maybe 30 yards off the road. I turned and saw her, an old tractor working the muddy furrows left by April's rains, moving in slow parallel passes the way a machine does when the person running it knows exactly what they're doing and doesn't need to think about it anymore. The tractor was the color of old copper left out in the weather, dented along the hood, a curl of black exhaust drifting back over the cab. And the woman driving it, blonde hair, the pale golden kind that catches light even under the shadow of a worn cap, she sat straight-backed and still, both hands on the wheel, eyes moving over the furrows with the same careful attention a doctor gives a patient. She wasn't looking at me. She wasn't looking at the road. She was looking at the land the way you look at something that is both your livelihood and your inheritance and your problem all at once. I stood there longer than I needed to. Longer than was strictly reasonable for a man with a broken radiator hose and a schedule to keep. Then I picked up my water bottle, climbed through the fence wire, and walked toward her. I couldn't have told you exactly why. Only that something about the way she studied that ground made me feel like I wanted to understand it too. She saw me before I was halfway across the field. I know that now, though she gave no sign of it at the time, didn't slow the tractor, didn't turn her head, just kept working the row with that same unhurried precision. It was only when I stopped at the edge of the furrow and raised a hand that she finally brought the machine around and cut the engine. The silence that followed was the particular kind you only get in open country, not empty, but full of smaller sounds, wind in the fence wire, a meadowlark somewhere to the north, the soft settling of the engine heat. She climbed down and looked at me the way a mechanic looks at an unfamiliar engine. Not hostile. Not welcoming. Just assessing, from the boots up, taking inventory of what she was dealing with before committing to any particular response. She was younger than I'd expected, mid-30s, maybe, with that pale golden hair pulled back under a faded cap, and eyes that were a steady, clear gray, the color of sky before rain decides what it's going to do. "Your truck," she said. It wasn't a question. "Radiator hose. I've got the part, wrong coupling." I kept it short. Something told me she'd appreciate that. She nodded once, the way people nod when the world confirms what they already suspected. "Shop's unlocked. Back of the barn. Don't touch anything that isn't broke." She turned back toward the tractor. "I'm Colt," I said. She paused without turning around. "Ren." Then she climbed back up and started the engine, and that was that. She studied me the way she studied engines, methodically, without sentiment, looking for the weak spot before deciding whether the whole thing was worth her time. I found the shop and got to work. It was a good barn, organized the way only someone who actually uses a space keeps it organized, tools hung by size, labeled coffee cans of hardware sorted by thread, a workbench worn smooth from years of use. I fixed the coupling, replaced the hose, topped the coolant, and had the truck running again inside of 90 minutes. I should have left then. I know that. But I'd noticed, on the walk back from the barn, that the screen door on the farmhouse was hanging off its top hinge, swollen with spring humidity, and that a fence post near the gate was listing at an angle that would give way inside of a week. Small things. The kind that pile up quietly on a person running a farm alone. I was still looking at that fence post when two vehicles turned in off the road within minutes of each other, a county inspection truck and a dark blue pickup so clean it looked like it had never seen a dirt road in its life. The man who got out of the inspection truck carried a clipboard and wore the expression of someone who finds satisfaction in bad news. The man from the blue pickup wore a pressed shirt and a smile that had been practiced in a mirror. They knew each other, I could tell that much, the way they didn't acknowledge each other, the deliberate non-greeting of people with a shared agenda. I stayed by the fence post and listened. The clipboard man, Hadley, he introduced himself, informed Wren in flat, bureaucratic language that her planting loan would be frozen unless the farm cleared a safety compliance checklist within 3 weeks. The list was long. The man in the pressed shirt, who introduced himself as Boone, waited until Hadley had finished before stepping forward with a folded document and a number that was clean and round and immediate. A buyout offer. Cash. He said it like he was doing her a favor. Wren held the document for a moment, then folded it in half and held it back out to him. "Not interested," she said. Quiet. Absolute. Boone smiled like a man who has been told no before and found it temporary. Hadley handed her a copy of the checklist and they both left. Wren stood in the drive looking at the paper. She didn't look panicked. She looked like someone doing the math in their head and not loving the answer. I walked over. She didn't look up. 3 weeks is enough time, I said. If you've got a shop and someone who knows what they're doing. She looked up then. That gray gaze again, steady and measuring. You offering cot and use of the shop. That's all I need. A long pause. The meadowlark again, farther off now. She looked back at the checklist, then at the barn, then at me, and I had the distinct feeling she was running the same calculation 3 different ways just to be sure. Don't touch anything that isn't broke, she said finally. It was the same thing she'd said that morning. But this time, I understood it was a different kind of permission. The days fell into a rhythm the way good work always does, not by agreement, but by repetition. I was up before light, same as her. She'd have coffee on the stove, 2 cups, neither of us making a particular point of it. She'd go out to the fields. I'd go to the shop. We'd pass each other at noon, exchange maybe a dozen words about what needed doing, and go back to it. It was the most comfortable arrangement I'd had in years, which should have told me something, though I filed that observation away and didn't look at it too closely. Old Copper was in worse shape than the compliance checklist required me to care about, but I cared anyway. That's the honest truth of it. The injector pump was leaking at the return line and running rich because of it, wasteful and hard on the rings over time. The hydraulic lift hesitated under load in a way that would eventually strand her midfield on a bad day. I pulled the pump, rebuilt it with a seal kit I ordered from a parts house in Amarillo, and had it back in by the 3rd morning. The hydraulics took longer. I fabricated a new pressure valve from stock I found in the back of the shop, tested it, adjusted it, tested it again. When I finally put the loader through a full cycle and watched it move clean and immediate without a single stutter, I felt something I don't feel often enough, the specific satisfaction of a thing brought back from the edge of failure and made right. I also welded a roll cage to code. She hadn't asked for it. It wasn't on the checklist. But the original cab frame had a stress fracture along the left upright that nobody had noticed yet, and I wasn't going to leave that alone. I didn't mention it to her. I just fixed it. There's a kind of conversation that happens between 2 people who work near each other in silence for long enough. It doesn't use words. But it's real. Along the way I found other things. The screen door I'd noticed on day 1, I rehung it on a Tuesday afternoon, took 20 minutes. A water line behind the equipment shed had been seeping into the gravel since March at least, judging by the mineral staining on the concrete. I dug it out, sweated a new coupling in, and packed the trench back before she came in for supper. A fence post near the east pasture gate was one good wind away from failing. I set it in new concrete on a Thursday. She noticed all of it, I could tell by the way she'd pause at the screen door or glance at the fence line without comment. She didn't thank me for any of it. That was fine. It wasn't done for thanks. What she did, eventually, was start talking to me. Not about herself, not directly, not yet. But about the farm. About the land. She'd tell me a field had flooded in the same low corner every spring since her father ran it, or that the east well had always run slightly alkaline and what that meant for certain crops. She talked about the land the way some people talk about family, with a mixture of deep loyalty and clear-eyed frustration that only comes from something you didn't choose but wouldn't trade. I listened. I'm good at listening. It's one of the few things I've never had to learn. Then the storm came. It built all afternoon on the western horizon, the way plain storms do, slowly and then all at once, the sky going from hazy white to a deep, bruised green in the space of an hour. By evening it was on us, hard-driving rain, lightning walking across the fields in long bright strides, the kind of downpour that turns low ground into lake bottom overnight. We lost power at 9. I sat in the shop doorway watching it come down and thinking that the low pasture was going to be underwater by morning. I was right. At first light, Wren's second tractor, an older utility machine she used for the back fields, was axle-deep in standing water, sunk into the softened earth where the drainage ditch had backed up and overflowed. She was already standing at the pasture fence in her rain gear when I got there, assessing it with that same still expression she brought to every problem. The rain was still falling, lighter now but steady. "Old Copper can pull it," I said. She looked at me. "Ground still soft. You'll sink her too." "Not if we move fast and keep the weight distributed." "I'll chain low, keep the angle shallow." I paused. "I've done worse." Another one of those long, measuring pauses. Then she went for the chain. We worked in the rain for 40 minutes. I drove Old Copper into the flooded pasture, felt the tires grab and slip and grab again, got the chain set at the right angle on the undercarriage of the stuck machine, and pulled, slow and steady, no sudden throttle, just even constant pressure, the way you coax something out of a bad situation rather than yanking it and making things worse. Wren stood on the running board beside me, one hand on the cab frame, calling the angle. When the stuck tractor finally broke free with a long sucking sound and rolled onto higher ground, she exhaled once, sharp and quiet, like someone releasing a breath they'd been holding for a long time. We drove Old Copper back to the barn in the rain without speaking. It was only when I cut the engine and the drumming on the roof softened that she said it. "Your truck's been running since day 4, she said. Not accusing. Just stating a fact she'd been holding on to. I checked. I didn't deny it. I sat there with my hands on the wheel and looked straight ahead through the rain-streaked windshield. "I know," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "Okay. Just that. Just okay." But something in the barn shifted when she said it, something that had been held at a careful distance between us, and neither of us moved to leave for a long while after. It was Wren who found it first. She came back from the south fence line on a Wednesday morning with mud on her boots and something careful in her expression, not panic, but the particular stillness of a person who has found a problem and is already deciding how much of it to say out loud. She set a mason jar on the workbench beside me without comment. Inside it, creek water, cloudy and faintly iridescent, the way water gets when something petroleum-based has been introduced to it. A thin chemical sheen caught the light when I tilted the jar. "How far up?" I asked. 40 yards past the property corner. Maybe more." She paused. "The crawfish are gone. There were crawfish in that stretch all last summer." I set down my wrench and looked at the jar for a long moment. "Crawfish don't leave clean water. That's not biology I had to look up, it's the kind of thing you absorb when you've spent enough years working land and water and the spaces between them." Whatever was in that creek hadn't come from her property. It had come from upstream. And upstream, past the corner post and through the tree line, was land that belonged to Boone. I didn't say that yet. I just said, "I'll take samples in the morning," and went back to work. But I didn't sleep much that night. Some things are too convenient to be accidents. A spill that surfaces 10 days before a compliance deadline, on a farm a man has been trying to buy for months, that's not bad luck. That's a plan. I was at the creek bank before 5 the next morning, while the sky was still more dark than light. I took samples at 4 points, 2 on her side of the line, 1 at the boundary, 1 as far upstream as I could reach without crossing onto posted land. Glass vials, sealed, labeled with location and time. I photographed the surface sheen, the dead vegetation along the bank, the soil discoloration where the waterline had receded. I'd carried hazmat certification for 12 years, mostly for pipeline work. I knew how to document a contamination site in a way that would hold up to review. I worked quietly and methodically and tried not to let my anger get ahead of my hands. Then I heard a vehicle. Not on the road. Coming along the tree line from the north, no headlights, moving slow. I pressed back into the willow cover at the bank's edge and went still. An old work truck eased to a stop about 60 yards upstream, just inside the tree line on the far side of the boundary. The door opened and a man got out. Even in the low pre-dawn light, the pressed shirt was recognizable. Boone. He moved to the truck bed without hurrying, the way a man moves when he believes he is completely alone, and lifted out 2 plastic containers, 5-gallon jugs, the kind used for agricultural chemicals. He walked them to the creek's edge, unscrewed the caps, and began pouring. I had my phone out before I'd consciously decided to use it. I filmed for 90 seconds. Long enough to see his face clearly in the growing light, long enough to capture the containers, long enough to watch the fluid hit the water and spread. My hands were steady. I've learned over the years that anger, if you let it settle rather than boil, becomes something more useful, a cold, clear focus that knows exactly what it's doing. He capped the empty jugs, walked them back to the truck, and drove away the same direction he'd come. I waited until the sound of the engine faded entirely before I moved. I walked back to the farm slowly, thinking through what I had and what it meant. The video was time-stamped. The sample locations were documented. The containers he'd used were a specific type sold for industrial solvents, not the kind any legitimate agricultural operation keeps in a work truck bed at 4:50 in the morning. And his timing was too clean. 10 days before Wren's compliance deadline. A contamination event on a farm boundary that would trigger an environmental hold and make planting impossible. Hadley would have no choice but to act on it, and Boone would be standing there with his clean cash and his folded document, looking sympathetic. I found Wren in the kitchen when I got back. She looked at my boots, then at my face, and knew something had shifted. "Tell me," she said. So I did. All of it, the samples, the footage, what I'd seen and how long I'd suspected it. She listened without interrupting, which I'd come to understand was how she processed things that mattered. When I finished she was quiet for a full minute, both hands wrapped around her coffee mug, looking out the window at the fields she'd been working since before she could name what working meant. "He's been after this land for 3 years, she said finally. Not surprised. Just confirming a thing she'd known the shape of for a long time without having proof to fit around it. "He made a mistake this morning," I said. "He thought he was alone." She turned from the window and looked at me, that gray, clear gaze, and for the first time since I'd climbed through her fence line, something in it was not just measuring. Something in it was close to grateful, though she wouldn't have used that word, and I wouldn't have asked her to. "What do we do with it?" she asked. I picked up the USB drive I'd already loaded from my phone and set it on the table between us. "We walk into that bank," I said, "and we lay it all out. I've sat across a lot of tables in my life, foremen's desks, job site trailers, the occasional county permit office smelling of burnt coffee and old carpet. I know how those rooms work. I know the particular power of a man who controls paperwork, and I know the particular powerlessness of someone who needs something from him. What I've learned, over 41 years of moving through the world with my hands and not much else, is that the only thing that neutralizes that dynamic is evidence. Not argument. Not volume. Evidence, organized clearly, presented without emotion, and laid down on the table like a hand of cards you're willing to let speak for itself. The conference room at the county bank branch smelled of recycled air and new carpet. The compliance director, a heavy-set woman named Pruitt who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the expression of someone who had seen every variety of human foolishness and was no longer surprised by any of it, sat at the head of the table. The risk officer, a younger man whose name I didn't retain, sat to her left with a legal pad. Hadley was there with his clipboard, looking mildly uncomfortable. And Boone was there too, at the far end of the table, in the pressed shirt, with the practiced smile already in place. He looked at me with the particular blankness of a man who doesn't yet know he should be worried. I set the binder on the table and opened it without preamble. Compliance checklist, completed item by item with photographs and documentation. Fabrication certifications for the roll cage weld, stamped and dated. Hydraulic test results. Safety signage. Fire suppression inspection. Everything Hadley had listed, addressed and verified. I walked through it in about 8 minutes, and when I finished, Pruitt turned pages in silence for a moment and then looked up. "This is thorough," she said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an acknowledgement, which from her seemed to be worth more. Boone's smile didn't disappear all at once. It faded the way light fades at the end of a day, gradually, then completely, and then you couldn't quite remember what it had looked like. "There's a second matter," I said, and slid the USB drive across the table to the risk officer. I talked them through it methodically. The creek samples, the documentation protocol, my hazmat certification number so they could verify my credentials independently. The time-stamped photographs of the contamination site. And then the video, 91 seconds of pre-dawn footage, clear enough that the face was unmistakable, clear enough that the containers were identifiable, clear enough that the act was unambiguous. I watched the risk officer's pen slow and then stop moving on his legal pad. I watched Hadley look at the table. And I watched Boone's expression go through several changes in rapid succession before it settled into something flat and still and carefully neutral. Pruitt watched the footage twice. Then she closed the laptop and folded her hands on top of the binder and looked down the table at Boone for a long moment without speaking. It was the kind of silence a person of authority uses deliberately, not because they don't know what to say, but because they want the other party to understand exactly how serious the space before the words is. "Mr. Boone," she said finally, "I'd strongly suggest you have legal counsel present before this conversation continues." She said it with the flat courtesy of someone closing a door. Then she looked at Wren. "The operational hold is lifted. The planting loan stands. This office considers Miss Calloway to be in full compliance." She paused. "More than full. This is a farm doing everything correctly in the face of a problem it didn't create." Hadley stood when it was over, and for just a moment he seemed uncertain what to do with his hands. Then he crossed to Wren and extended one, and she shook it, briefly, without warmth, but without hostility either. It was the handshake of someone who distinguishes between the instrument and the hand that aimed it. Boone left without a word, the legal exposure hanging over him like weather, and I didn't watch him go. We drove back to the farm mostly in silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty. The first clear morning of May proper had arrived while we were in that conference room, the sky a deep, washed blue, the fields catching the light along the tops of the new growth in long green lines. Wren looked out the passenger window at her land passing, and I didn't interrupt whatever she was doing with that view. Back at the barn, I pulled the red compliance tag off the door myself, peeled the adhesive corner back slowly, took the whole thing off clean. Wren was standing at old Coppa's fender with one hand resting on the hood, and when I turned around she was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before. Not the measuring look. Not the still, assessing gaze she kept ready like a tool. Something quieter than that. Something that had set down its guard without making an announcement about it. She almost smiled. For Wren Calloway, that was the equivalent of anyone else throwing their arms wide open. The field stretched out ahead of us, green and unhurried, full of the particular promise that only exists at the start of a planting season before any of it can go wrong. I thought about the road behind me, all the towns and jobs and mornings I'd passed through without staying. I thought about the decision I'd made standing at a wire fence with a broken radiator and no particular reason to climb through it. "You coming?" she said. I climbed up and took my place on the fender seat beside her. Old Coppa's engine turned over on the first try, steady and low, the way a well-tended thing runs when it's finally been given the care it deserved all along. For the first time and longer than I could honestly account for, the road behind me felt like exactly the right place to have come from. Thanks for watching. If this story meant something to you, please like and subscribe for more unforgettable stories about love, resilience, and second chances.